Thank you very much, Beatrice. And I would like to first of all join the Cardinal in welcoming you all here and thanking you all for being part of this important meeting. And of course, I'd especially like to thank Greg, who was the real power behind this whole organization. So thank you very much, Greg. So my job is to give you a little overview of Pacem in Terris. We're 60 years since the publication of this document in 1963. And I think we can call it a landmark document, which my illustrious predecessor, Stefano Zamagni, who will be sitting up here a bit later today, notes in his contribution to this meeting, was deposited in the archives of the United Nations and was the first papal encyclical to be published in full in the New York Times. I don't know how important that is, but anyway, that's in some way indicative. Of course, as we've already heard, it's noteworthy because it was inspired by Pope John XXIII's experience in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, as we know, those of you here better than I, one of the nearest times we ever got to a nuclear conflagration. And his message, which he sent to Kennedy and Khrushchev, which was subsequently read as a radio address, and which Khrushchev acknowledged had moved him and had contributed to easing the crisis. So he could see very concretely that his intervention had made a difference. So that was what was inspiring this document. From the point of view of the Church, it's interesting to note that this is the first of the social encyclicals. So these are the teachings that the popes do on social issues. Cardinal Turkson already mentioned Rerum Novarum. That's considered one of the first ones in the modern series from 1891. The modern teaching from then onward, usually up to that point, was seen as a kind of a celebration of Rerum Novarum, and it was always made on an anniversary of Rerum Novarum. So it was 1931 or 1961 or 1971 and so on. This was 1963. So this is a different document starting a new tradition, if you like, standing on its own. Okay. So in 1963, memories of the Second World War were still fresh, and the prospect of a new war, one fought with nuclear weapons, led Pope John to reflect on the conditions for peace in a world on the threshold of a new millennium. People already thinking about that at that stage. A world marked by dramatic social transformations, a new framework for international relations, we're talking about the UN, of course, and on the negative side, new forms of weaponry with the potential to extinguish human life on Earth. So the Pope's goal in writing the encyclical was to offer a comprehensive vision of peace, both its positive aspects, what humankind could aspire to, and its negative aspects, what outcomes should be avoided. So the first led him to a discussion of big issues like personhood, justice, rights, duties, equality, and the common good, both within and between nations. As to the second, he concentrated on the dangers represented by weaponry, nuclear weapons especially, and the attendant risks of an arms race. So in our meeting today, as you know from the title of it, we decided to focus on obstacles to peace, and among those to give special attention to the most severe of those obstacles, the prosecution of war. So I would like to present this short overview of Pacem in Terris in relation to the obstacles to peace, and to ask the question, what does Pacem in Terris suggest we need to do to overcome those obstacles? So the first thing I think the Pope wants to say, and perhaps the main thing, the most important thing, is to recognize the basic structure of reality, or the key characteristics of the world we live in. In the face of the climate crisis, which leads us to recognize, especially those of us dealing with economic issues, which is where mostly I work, which leads us to recognize that we cannot treat the natural world just as we like, but we can only treat it as it is. We may be more open today to recognizing this structure of reality than people were in the 1960s. So the main word that Pope John uses in this regard is the word order. This is a crucial word for him, order. A word we know from international relations. We talk about an international or global order. And we also use in general when we say things like they are in good order. Okay? So order always refers to goals that are to be achieved and goods to be created. If something is ordered, it's ordered to something, and if it's in good order, it will allow us to achieve our goals. So this term forms a kind of frame for the whole of Pope John's text. It is very present at the beginning of the document, then in the section when he refers to the overall, it's very present at the beginning of the document. Then again at the point where he talks about relations between states, and finally at the end of the text. So he brings it in at these key moments. The order in the world, he says, can be described partly in scientific terms, but it also refers to the overall goals of human beings and their relationships, which brings us to a philosophical and even theological level. Pope John focuses on the recognition of one key principle, and I'm quoting, that each individual is truly a person, and then he describes what this means. His is a nature that is endowed with intelligence and free will. As such, because of that, he has rights and duties, which together flow as a direct consequence from his nature. These rights and duties are universal and inviolable, and therefore altogether inalienable. So that's his key principle. After this, he starts discussing some of the rights that human beings have. Interestingly, economic rights get particular attention, which is perhaps already moving towards what Cardinal Turkson was saying about development as peace. Then he moves on to corresponding duties. And it's perhaps interesting at this point to note that the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also wanted to include duties in their document. But since they couldn't get agreement on the duties, they ended up publishing the declaration only with the rights. The initial plan was to have duties as well. So after discussing rights and duties then, the Pope turns to the question of state authority and its relation to citizens. On the one hand, he will argue that authority ultimately comes from God. Very strong statement. So there is a presumption that each person should follow it. But on the other, human authority needs to know its limits, which come from the moral order. Get that word order again. For instance, he gives some examples of this limit. One of them is human authority cannot control the conscience of other people, hence the right to freedom of belief. Okay, so that's the first thing. Recognize the structure of reality as it is. Second stage in this is to look at the relations between states. States do not exist in a condition of anarchy, he would say, where the goal of each is to protect itself from the others, seeking its own advantage. And I say this remembering that the realist position in international relations would be quite close to that view, and I'm trying to say that's not really real. Or the Pope would say it's not really real. For the consequences of this approach, fear and deterrence, can never provide a secure foundation for international order. Going back to this word, showing that they do not recognize the real state of affairs. They can't give a solid foundation to order. Rather, he urges states to recognize how their relations must be guided by the exigencies of four things: truth, justice, charity, and freedom. These are the four pillars that Cardinal Turkson mentioned. He says, love, not fear, must dominate the relationships between individuals and between nations. The centrality of truth entails that propaganda, today we would speak of disinformation, must be excluded as, he says, a poison in the social body. Because human relations pertain first and foremost to the spiritual, non-material order, human beings must seek out ways of communing in truth. Scientific inquiry and the search for new technologies can have an important role in this regard. The primacy of truth also entails that human beings, and indeed nations, must strive to sort out their differences through speech. True speech, not arms, not deceit or trickery. He says, there must be a mutual assessment of the arguments and feelings on both sides, a mature and objective investigation of the situation, and an equitable reconciliation of opposing views. A realistic view of our situation would encourage states to pursue mutual collaboration, pooling their material and spiritual resources when needed for the common good. To this end, he praised the work of international agencies and looked for their further development. So only after this presentation of the way things really are, quite a bit into the text, does the Pope move to considerations regarding things we need to stop or prevent, this negative side, things that we might regard as the usual ones which we talk about in peace building. At this level, Pope John cautioned against the arms trade. While acknowledging that powerful weapons can act as a deterrent, this alone does not provide a basis for international order, this order we're talking about, which cannot be built up on fear alone. As he has already said, since mutual trust is the only solid foundation. Heavy investment in weaponry, as spurred by perceptions of an arms race with states trying to keep up with one another, drains intellectual and material resources away from other more vital needs, and in so doing detracts from economic and social development. Then we get to nuclear weapons, which are particularly nefarious, insofar as their testing can despoil the Earth and its atmosphere. Their very existence intensifies the danger that miscalculation, accidents, and unforeseen circumstances could lead to a conflagration on a global scale. He says quite clearly, nuclear weapons must be banned. He added that the ban should come about as a result of a general agreement reached on the basis of a suitable disarmament program with an effective system of mutual control. While we are accustomed to speech this kind today, when it was uttered by Pope John XXIII in 1963, at a time when the very notion of arms control was just beginning to emerge, it brought the imperative of nuclear disarmament before the public eye in a striking way. Reflecting on the ghastly and catastrophic consequence that would follow from the use of nuclear weapons, he concluded that any resort to armed force, even by conventional means, and perhaps for worthy reasons, would risk tipping the world into a downward escalatory spiral. Hence, the most memorable line from his encyclical. In this age, which boasts of its atomic power, it no longer makes sense to maintain that war is a fit instrument with which to repair the violation of justice. So finally, Pope John emphasized that disarmament is not a task for governments and statespeople alone, although the chief responsibility lies with them, but must be assumed into the outlook of each and every person and reach into our very souls, he says. So this prefigures at the teaching of later popes, Pope Francis most especially, who have spoken about the importance of establishing a culture of peace with non-violent means of conflict resolution at their core, at its core. So as we open our discussions regarding war and other obstacles to peace, let us keep in mind the approach of this great and influential text that we are celebrating in this meeting. Let us keep in mind the reality of things, just as economists now need to keep in mind the reality of the environment in a way that they did not do before, so that this influences our deliberations on the various developments in war making, on what needs to be prohibited, and on how other developments need to be regulated, all with a view to moving towards a situation where, as Pope St. John Paul II put it so eloquently, war has become part of the tragic past. Thank you very much.